This is Green Tide Rising, a podcast following Latin America's green wave abortion rights movement.
And how it's unveiling a blueprint for global reproductive freedom.
I'm Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm Asha Dyer.
Last episode, we were in Brazil, where we met Rebecca Mendez, the first Latin American woman to petition the Supreme Court for the right to a legal abortion, who had to cross borders to get the reproductive care she needed. We also got some fascinating insights about how Brazilian women have self-managed their abortions since the 1980s.
And for this episode, we're changing up the format a little. Our green wave expert, Ximena Casas, is joined by storyteller and activist Paola Mendoza and Danielle Rodriguez, the Georgia coordinator at Sistersong. We wanted to have a more in-depth discussion with these brilliant badass leaders to find out how the green wave has inspired their own work and how we can bring it to our shores.
As of now, Georgia's abortion laws are highly restrictive.
This is Danielle, Sistersong's Georgia coordinator. Back in September, ProPublica broke the news that in Georgia, at least 2 women had died after they couldn't access legal abortions and timely medical care. One of those women was Amber Thurman.
Yeah, we trusted them to take care of her, and they just let her die because of some stupid abortion ban.
Less than a week after the world learned about Amber, her family joined presidential nominee Kamala Harris and Oprah for an emotional conversation. You just heard her sister Andrika, and that abortion ban that she's talking about is Georgia's heartbeat bill.
In 2019, Georgia passed the heartbeat bill, which bans abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy, often before many people even know they are pregnant.
Back in 2019, Governor Brian Kemp won his Georgia Senate race against Stacey Abrams. And the first year he was governor, the heartbeat bill was a priority. The day he signed the bill, he said,
"Thank you all. Today is just the beginning, folks. We must protect life at all stages. And we must remember to work in the days, months, and years ahead."
Advocates, including Sistersong, worked to block the ban in court. Here is Monica Simpson, the executive director, back in 2019 at a press conference, talking about the lawsuit.
Today, we stand here with our partner organizations, Feminist Women's Health Center and Planned Parenthood Southeast, and the numerous healthcare professionals as the lead plaintiff in this case against Kemp, and we are excited to officially file this motion to ask the court to block House Bill 481 from going into effect before January 2020.
Abortion providers and advocates were able to temporarily block the law, arguing the bill was in violation of Roe v. Wade, and it never went into effect. But then Roe fell, and the law went into effect July 2020. And Governor Kemp's reaction?
Overjoyed that the court has paved the way for the implementation of Georgia's Life Act.
For people who can get pregnant in Georgia, this has devastating consequences. The 6-week ban severely limits access to abortion care, forcing individuals to travel out of state if they need a later abortion, which can be financially and emotionally burdensome.
But for Amber Thurman, the Georgia Life Act was a death sentence.
This heartbreaking news just underscores the dangerous reality that these laws create. By denying access to necessary reproductive health care, including abortions, we are witnessing the loss of life that could have been prevented with proper medical care.
Amber Thurman was 28. She had her sights set on nursing school, and she felt that she was finally getting her life together for her and her son. They had just moved into a place of their own. But then she found out she was pregnant with twins. And the timing could not have been worse because she had just passed the 6-week mark. She and her best friend drove across the border to North Carolina, a state with a 12-week ban where she could still get care. They left at 4 a.m. to get to the appointment on time. However, she got stuck in traffic and missed the appointment. Luckily, she was able to access pills from the clinic to self-manage her abortion at home. Now, medication abortion has very low rates of complications, but problems can happen. And in Amber's case, not all of the pregnancy tissue had been expelled from her uterus. Her side effects began to get worse. So her boyfriend called for an ambulance and Amber was rushed to the ER. Had Amber lived near the clinic in North Carolina that she got the pill from, they would have performed a DNC, dilation and curettage, a surgical procedure that allows you to remove abnormal tissue from the uterine lining. But she was 4 hours away. When she arrived at a Georgia emergency room with bleeding, pain, and falling blood pressure, doctors didn't immediately give her care. They instead monitored her infection as it spread.
Amber Thurman waited hours and hours for help, and medical providers didn't know what to do because the abortion ban was so new at the time. They didn't know what to do, and they were afraid that they were going to face criminal charges.
Here's Amber's sister, Andrika, again.
It's very disheartening that my sister was allowed to suffer for 20 hours. She suffered. It was nothing that we could do to help her. We trusted the healthcare professionals to do their job and save her, but they failed her.
Abortion providers can face up to 10 years in prison for providing abortions outside of the exceptions in the state of Georgia.
It's devastating news because this is just healthcare and this is your job. This is their job, and she needed help. And I'm curious about the doctor that did decide to finally do the DNC, which is a normal procedure. I'm curious about what clicked in that doctor's head, but unfortunately, it was too late. It was too late.
Amber Thurman died from a treatable infection at a hospital where medical providers were well equipped to treat her. This year, a state maternal mortality review board ruled Amber's death was preventable. But they never told the family. They didn't hear the news until they were told by a reporter at ProPublica.
When ProPublica came to my home, I pushed them away. No, but Kavithia, she was persistent. She said, it was something that you needed to know. You have to hear me.
That was Amber's mother. At first, she didn't want to share her pain with the public.
I wanted to go through in silence, but I realized that it was selfish. Women around the world, people around the world need to know that this was preventable. 2 years later, you're looking at a mother that is broken. Mm-hmm. The worst pain ever that a mother, that a parent could ever feel.
This is Green Tide Rising. Stay with us.
Hey, Asha.
Hi, Monica, and welcome everyone to episode 7 of Green Tide Rising. We all know abortion bans harm women and people who can get pregnant. Once a ban is implemented, it only takes a few weeks before we start to see its lethal effects.
Throughout the season, we've chronicled the impacts of these types of bans across Latin America. But just as you heard, the same things are happening here in the United States.
These are just the people that we know of, and this is just in the state of Georgia. There is so much work to be done, and we can all be part of the fight to make sure that women and people who can get pregnant do not suffer the same tragedy as Amber. And as Ximena Casas says, the green wave has many different green tones. So by gathering together Ximena, Paola, and Danielle, we're going to learn about the tones that they occupy and why we need the green wave now more than ever. So let's get into that conversation.
So let's go around the table, introduce yourselves, and tell us a little bit about how you got into this work.
Hi, my name is Ximena Casas. I'm a Colombian feminist lawyer. I grew up in a country where access to education and healthcare is a privilege. When I was early in my 20s, I had the opportunity to do an internship at Human Rights Watch, where I was able to work with the researcher on the Women's Rights Division that she was working on the first report on abortion in Latin America conducted in Argentina. And through her guidance, I just got involved and love about this work. I then ended up working for Planned Parenthood Global for more than 15 years, and I understand that abortion is a healthcare service that should be access to everyone.
And my name is Paola Mendoza. I am Colombian, born in Colombia and raised in the United States, and then went back to Colombia for my teenage years. So I have a deep love, profound, complicated relationship with Colombia, but it also is foundational to who I am and how I see the world. First and foremost, I'm a storyteller rather than an activist. I tell stories in all different ways, and I tell the stories of the women like my mother and of my mother, and I see them as the unsung heroes of this country, the women that we often ignore, yet they are so foundational to who we are. And part of my mother's story is that when we first arrived in this country, my mom, my brother, my father, and I came. And my father, after being here a few months, told my mom he was going to work, and then he never came back. He abandoned us, and we had no family. We had absolutely nothing here. My mom didn't speak English. But my mom found out she was pregnant a few weeks after he left. And my mother was able to access an abortion, and my mother's abortion story became intertwined with our immigration story. And that story has always been a part of our story. I don't even remember the first time that I found out about my mother's abortion because it wasn't a big deal. It just was what happened to us while we were here.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I am the Georgia Program Coordinator at Sistersong, the National Women of Reproductive Justice Collective. And as a reproductive justice organization, we're fighting for the fundamental right to make decisions about our bodies and for policies that protect our communities, particularly those most impacted by restrictive abortion bans. So we believe that everyone deserves access to safe and affordable and timely health care. And we're going to continue advocating for the change that Georgia desperately needs. I got into this work due to losing custody of my daughter over 10 years ago due to financial barriers. Her father, due to him making more money, looked more fit and was able to get custody. And because of that, I felt so alone. I started doing research to try to find out what needed to be done, what community was out there for me. And I found the reproductive justice movement, and they rallied behind me, supported me, and I was able to get my daughter back, who's now 20. And I learned what community really meant. And I've been part of the movement ever since.
Paola, you recently released a short animated film that you directed and wrote called Romina, which shares the story of a girl that you helped get an abortion.
Accidentally pregnant at 14 is a bad situation anywhere. Accidentally pregnant at 14 post-Dobbs in a state where abortion is a crime is absolutely terrifying.
Can you share more about Romina's story with us?
When I received the call from Romina's mother a year ago, and it's exactly a year ago, actually, that Romina was pregnant, I was enraged. And I definitely was not enraged at Romina or Romina's mother. I was enraged at the situation that we found ourselves in. I've known Romina since she was 10 years old. Romina is undocumented. Her mother is undocumented. They live in a southern state with a severe ban. Romina had just started to have sex, and I told Romina's mom we should get her on birth control. She's dating someone older, it's most likely going to happen. And as a very strict Catholic, it was difficult for her to make that decision for her daughter to get on birth control, but they decided that this was the best thing for them. They went to the doctor to get on birth control, and they did a pregnancy test at the doctor's office, and that's when they found out Romina, who was 14 at the time, was pregnant. She was very early on in her pregnancy, and the family decided, the mother decided that they felt safest leaving the state that they lived in because they didn't want to do anything illegal in their state, mostly because they were undocumented. Even when we were telling them, and I spoke to many lawyers, what their rights were within the laws that they were living in, they decided that they felt safest and best to leave their state. it was not an easy endeavor. There was 21, 22 people that had to help Romina get out of her state, come to New York, have an abortion with abortion pills. Her mother was not able to be with her because her mother had to continue to work and take care of her other siblings who were at home. So this young woman had an abortion in my house. And I've known Romina for, like I said, for many years, but I am not her mother. And so that to me was heartbreaking and enraging and infuriating, because we're seeing the impact on these laws are having on people whom already don't have access to so much. Romina just happened to know me, and I work in this space. I also organize. I also happen to know so many people that I could call and get help and access to lawyers and advice and doctors. But most people don't have that find themselves in Romina's situation. And so to tell her story was an important decision that obviously I talked about with Romina and her family and her mother. And they decided that they wanted to have their story out there, even at the risk to themselves, because they wanted to tell their story in order to show the injustice. But one of the things that was so impactful for Romina, as she says, is that in my house, I had women constantly coming in and out, and queer people coming in and out of my house to just provide support. We created a community care network for her, where everyone just on their own brought her gifts, shared their stories of their abortions, just talked to her, held her hand, watched movies with her. And to me, that is how we fight against these laws. While we're doing the policy work that's happening, while we're doing the organizing work, it's we coming together as a community independently of what's going on outside and taking care of one another. It is the only way forward. And when we hear Amber's story as well, that's what she did with her best friend. They drove to North Carolina to get her access to care. Her best friend was there throughout the entire time. And so we can't let people go through this alone.
Romina's story actually reminds me when I was a teenager. In Colombia, abortion was totally banned. And at that time, I had a friend that got pregnant. And because I have an open conversation at my family and I was always having access to sex ed information, I was able to take her to a private healthcare provider and have her safe abortion at the moment. But I also had other friends that got pregnant in their teens. They were expelled from high school, and some of them were forced to get married because of the shame of getting pregnant as an adolescent. And I think those stories are important and make us who we are and why we fight for these. But also show, even when we have abortion bans and it's very restrictive, we will look the ways to decide when and how we want to be mothers and if we want to. And just banning that healthcare services only make it more unsafe, and that's why the rates of maternal mortality are higher in countries with restrictive laws. So I think it is important also in the US that they look for other countries that have changed the policies. Colombia was a total ban when I was a teenager, and now we have one of the most progressive laws.
So when we're in community, we're able to create and expand access even with restrictive laws. And we see with Romina's story that with community, an abortion doesn't have to be scary. But when you're a person without bodily autonomy, like women who are incarcerated or in immigration detention, their rights are in the hands of the state.
Danielle, you spearheaded Sistersong's campaign in response to the shocking news about forced sterilizations among migrant women at Irwin County Detention Center in 2020. This is a case which sparked widespread public outrage and calls to reform after nurse and whistleblower Dawn Wooten exposed the center's criminal medical malpractice. Danielle, this story was terrifying. What was happening there?
Before Dawn Wooten came forward as the whistleblower, they called the doctor the womb collector, who was doing these sterilizations. Like, he would just do it to anyone that didn't speak English.
Here's Nurse Dawn Wooten giving testimony about what she experienced.
The ladies would put in to see the gynecologist, and they were having hysterectomies. They would come back oftentimes and question, why did I have to have a hysterectomy? I didn't have an answer. I had a detainee to ask me, she said, well, what is he doing, Miss Wooten, collecting all of our uteruses?
ICDC gained national attention after those reports surfaced of migrant women being subject to forced or coerced medical procedures. Our team played a pivotal role where we decided to do the history of eugenics in the United States, where we created an ebook that mapped the history of eugenics happening. Because what we were noticing was we were outraged, but we didn't understand why. We didn't understand why this hit home to us until we were able to provide our organizers with the history of eugenics and why this has been happening. And I'm first American. My parents are Puerto Rican and Jamaican. And my grandmothers survived eugenics narrowly by avoiding sterilization, by getting to the United States before it happened.
Okay, some background context here. In the 1930s, doctors in Puerto Rico falsely pushed women into sterilizations as the only means of contraception. It is estimated that between 1947 and 1948, 7% of Puerto Rico women were sterilized. And by 1956, 1 out of 3 women suffered the same fate. The United States has a very dark history around eugenics and forced sterilization of Black and brown women, which hasn't necessarily stopped, by the way. Instead, the ugly practice has found its way into our prison system and immigration centers.
But there were so many stories from both of them about it happening to their sisters, their cousins. It happened to my grandmother's mother, which she wasn't even having children at the time, and she was sterilized. So it was just really important to get this out into the community and make sure that the organizers and advocates were equipped with the language so that we knew what we were fighting for. And it took us a really long time to shut down Irwin County Detention Center. Georgia is really great with coalition work. So it was coalition-based with other organizations. So it wasn't just Sistersong. It was plenty of organizations working together to make sure that the shutdown happened. And one of the actions, we often would go to the detention center, and we've had a cookout outside the detention center. We've had a carnival. We've sung songs. We did everything we could to bring family members of those detained into that area so that their people can hear us outside advocating for them as much as we could. It makes me want to cry, but we used to hear them cheering at us and saying thank you as we would march outside Irwin County Detention Center.
Yeah, this idea of bringing a community of everyday people together to create a wave of joy in the midst of horror, that's really powerful. I mean, cookouts, carnivals, this is the activism I'm here for. It goes back to the idea that there are just so many ways to be part of the movement. Ximena, can you talk about sexual education or the lack of sexual education as being part of this movement, which feels obvious, but the lack of education is really shocking. Can you explain why?
We cannot make any decision if we are not informed. How we can be empowered if we don't have the information to make adequate decisions. Paola was saying about the experiences that she had and many around them had, and how if her mother didn't have the information, she wouldn't be able to be here and be able to have those access to the education and going to the university. And not only for teens, it should be starting in a very early age, 5 years old, and continues. And it should be an information that should be progressively given to all of us, women, men, everybody, so we can make informed decisions. And those that needs to make sure that those information are that those decisions are respected, also have the adequate information and know the stigma, which is what usually happens.
There's a trickle-down effect that happens when basic, medically accurate, comprehensive sex education becomes so politicized to the point it is taken out of school curriculums, as we are seeing in the US. And then we end up seeing all these things online and on social media that illustrate just how far-reaching the misinformation goes.
So often we see on social media these funny moments with men that don't understand tampons or how periods work. And I actually find those videos so ridiculously offensive because I'm going to assume most of those men have women in their lives. They're heterosexual based off of the assumptions that I have on what they're saying. And so they have these women in their lives and they know nothing. They know so little about women's lives that it is offensive, and yet we find it funny. And so reproductive health and sex education is so critical because it is the building block to, I believe, really having everyone understand the importance of access to abortion and reproductive freedom.
Yeah, I mean, it really does underscore and make you realize the need for sex education for everyone, clearly, and why movement leaders and activists in Latin America have included education and knowledge as part of the overall fight, right?
The power of the green wave and the story of how it started with Marta in Argentina and that symbol of the pañuelo, but how it spread and how that narrative was allowed to go through all of Latin America and eventually slowly trickle into the United States. And we can dig into why it hasn't arrived fully here yet and why we desperately need it. But that is the story of a movement, and to be involved in that movement and to be involved and be part of that story and be one of those tones, as Ximena was talking about, is a way also in which to motivate people and excite people and get them doing the community work that has ultimately, I think we can all say, really impacted and saved all of our lives.
What is also unique about the Green Wave is that it's not led by one person, right? It's driven by a community of people, a collective, who are advocating for the issues that are directly impacting them.
Yeah, we need to see ourselves reflected in the movements. We're the ones having these conversations. We're the ones experiencing this harm, that it's important to see us take the lead. When I think of the Green Wave, I think of what my ED, Monica Simpson, how she talks about reproductive justice as a movement united will never be defeated. And that's how I see the Green Wave. A movement united will never be defeated. And I know, like Paola said, we haven't had the fullness of the Green Wave come to the United States yet, but it's coming and it's going to be rich. I believe it's going to have everything that you just imagined, like the creativity, the storytelling. I believe it's going to be imaginative and visionary and just what we need to partner with reproductive justice organizations to continue doing this work. It is a beautiful movement. It inspires me every day.
I love that. You know, we've spoken about how you all got into the movement, but what advice would you give to folks looking to get involved?
If you have some extra dollars, abortion funds are in desperate need, so support your local abortion fund. And if you don't have extra dollars and if you have extra time, as Danielle was saying, where is your movement home in your local community? There are so many organizations that are in need of volunteers and in need of help if you have time to give. But I don't think that we can move forward in this country, especially if Donald Trump is elected in 2024, without assuming more risk. And so where is that risk? As an example, in Romina's story, there was someone that just drove Romina's mom and Romina to the airport and took them through the airport because they didn't have papers and they didn't know how to go through an airport. There's someone that did that is pretty low risk. And then there was other people that figured out how to have Romina get the pills and tell her the steps of getting her pills. And so all of those things require some sort of risk, and I think that's important too.
Everybody has a role to play in someone else's liberation. So I think it's really important to find what your role is in someone else's liberation. I think that's the first step in doing this work.
With the Green Wave movement, when I'm talking about the different green tones that everyone has a role to play, is that we all have different ways to contribute. Some may be conducting research and finding the data. Others will be through creating more advocacy strategies and legal strategies. So others will be just going to social media, posting, and others and many will be just having conversations in the dinner table. But thanks to the normalization of these conversations, being able to speak now, I actually feel proud to say that I'm a feminist, that I work for abortion rights, for a desired motherhood, for healthy families, for healthy generations. And I think it is part of just having these conversations with friends, with family, with co-workers. We today, without knowing Danielle, Paola, we all share stories about how we or others very close to us had an abortion. Abortion is something common that happens every day, and we should be able to be talking about that because it's not only an essential healthcare service, but it's also something common in our life that affects us and affects our family and affects our society. And the first step is just talking about it.
Okay, so speaking of society and conversations being the first step, let's talk about the green wave in the US. Why haven't we seen it take off here yet? And what is our biggest barrier?
So I'm going to say something that might ruffle some feathers a little bit, but I say it with love and I include myself in this criticism. And I'm going to start with a story. So that story goes back to before Roe fell, but when we knew Roe was falling, the year before, after the argument, and we pretty much knew that it was going to fall. There was some marches in Washington, D.C., and a lot of people showed up. I think it was 10, 15,000 people. It was lovely and great, and I was played a small part in the organizing of it. I came back from D.C. back to New York, and then about 2 days later, I was on my social media. My social media is both Latin America and in the United States. I have all kinds of stuff in Spanish. And I saw 2 days later that I believe it was International Safe Abortion Day, which is September 28th. It was amazing and beautiful. And I got so disappointed in myself and so disappointed in the movement here in the United States.
Why was that?
My disappointment was that we missed a huge opportunity to be connected to the movement that was happening in Latin America. And how amazing would it have been if we would have been part of that, knowing what was coming down the line. And this is where it might ruffle some feathers. And the disappointment was deeply within myself because I am from Latin America. My connection is strong in Colombia. And even I was blinded by the arrogance of being in the United States as if we always have the answers, that we couldn't look to the South. We couldn't look to Latin America for possible answers and inspiration. And I was so deeply mad at myself for a missed opportunity and for believing in the lie of the excellence of the United States, that I vowed that I was not going to participate in that again, that I was going to start making those connections to Latin America and start working with the organizers in Latin America to see and understand, as Danielle was saying, study their movements and their successes. And as luck would have it, as soon as I said that, about 2-3 weeks later, Paola Avila Guillen comes into my life, and she is, as Ximena knows, another Colombian sister, organizer in the fight in Latin America, in the Green Wave, plays critical roles throughout all of Latin America, and basically knows everything about the Green Wave that there is to know. And she and I, united here, hermanas and sisters in the States, were determined to bring the Green Wave here.
Paola, you're referring to the badass feminist lawyer, Paola Avila Guillen, who works for the Women's Equality Center, or we could just say WEC. They do incredible work bringing legislators, journalists, and activists from the U.S. to Latin America to show what's been happening in the region with the goal of raising awareness about issues like gender equality and reproductive freedom.
And so we started just as they did in Argentina. We just started going to rallies and handing out pañuelos and being like, hey, take this, and this is the Green Wave, and this is what's happening in Latin America, and talking about it and going to conferences and talking about it and connecting people and reaching out to organizations. And then it started to percolate a little bit in the movement here and there. And then there was a conversation here in the States around not wanting to culturally appropriate the concept and the idea of the Green Wave. And Paola and actually some other organizers from Latin America wrote an op-ed that said the pañuelo is not cultural appropriation. It's a political symbol, and you can't culturally appropriate political symbols. We want it to spread. We want it to get to the United States. We want the United States and Canada to be part of the movement of the Americas. The United States forgets that the Americas is many, many countries. And that is also part of the arrogance here that we are a part of when we live here. And so it has been slow, but it is happening. And obviously the strategies that worked in Argentina, Colombia, Mexico are not going to work here in the United States. It's different culturally, legally, all of it. But there are lessons to learn. And so I am so excited when we're able to have these cross-cultural, cross-country, borderless conversations around an issue that at the end of the day is trying to just control our bodies. And the right is really good of exporting what works in the United States down to the South. We see the movements of TERFs.
A quick moment for a GTR splainer here. For those unfamiliar with the term, TERF stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist, and it is a term used to describe feminists who are anti-trans and whose views on gender identity are considered hostile to transgender people.
They're using the same language that they've used successfully here in the United States to divide the feminist movement against trans people, unfortunately and horribly, and they're taking it down south to Latin America, and it's working there too. And TERFs are a serious problem in Latin America now as well. And so we have to learn and understand that we can export, import, and do all the things that work and adapt, evolutionize, and use that to get the world that we want, which is just bodily autonomy for everyone at the end of the day.
I also think that the Green Wave isn't an organization-led movement. It's a people-led movement. And that's the direction I feel like it's going to go in, where it's going to get some traction, is because it's people-led. And then I feel like that's when organizations will start to step in, of course, because that's what their members are going to demand from them. So once the people start demanding the Green Wave, that's when we're going to start seeing more traction and more movement. And I can't wait. I honestly cannot wait to see it happen.
Danielle, do you have a pañuelo?
I do not.
Oh, we're going to get you some pañuelos. Okay. We'll get you lots,
would love that.
So you can hand them out.
And we can have meetings and talk about this and really figure out how we're going to get the Green Wave in Georgia. Like, I am here for it.
We will converse, we will talk, we will organize, we will collaborate.
Exactly.
See, y'all, this is how it happens. Mm-hmm. You build your community.
Exactly.
So what are the key takeaways or lessons that each of you would like to share with listeners about building community?
There is not a magic recipe. And I think that sisterhood that we have understood from the movement is the most powerful strategy that we can have. I think that is what has been working for us, to generate a movement that everybody feels part and feels inspired. It is key, and I think I agree with Danielle, is getting there. You already have people in the rallies using the pañuelo. When we started in Latin America, there were only few, and now we are millions and millions, so it's getting there. The Green Wave is getting your shores.
So part of the strategy of the movement is a legal strategy, especially in this moment right now. And having politicians and lawmakers who are for the cause is always helpful. So Danielle, you are in Georgia right now. What does voter engagement look like in Georgia?
Yeah, so what we do is we just tell folks to vote for reproductive justice. We don't try to sway folks. We don't tell folks if they don't want to vote, they don't want to vote. Like, we don't do that. But we do say vote for what you believe in, vote for what's in alignment with you. And reproductive justice is what's growing right now, and that's what we tell people to stand for.
What does the power of voting mean to you, Paola, as a Latina, and for the community? Although we recognize it can be complicated or complex, and there are many gray areas, how do you think people who support reproductive justice and freedom can frame it as they head to the polls?
I would add to that to say, for the people that have a feeling that their vote doesn't matter, that they can't vote for, let's say, I'm a Kamala Harris supporter, understanding that Kamala Harris, A, is not my hero, B, is a politician, C, needs to be held accountable for the things that she's done that are wrong, and D, needs to be pushed towards a more progressive, inclusive world ideology. I believe all of that. And some of those hold contradictions. I hold the contradictions as well. And yet, I say all of that to say that I believe that Donald Trump is an existential threat. Yes, to democracy. Sure, to a system that is flawed and has fucked us over many times over. Yes. But he is an existential threat to me, to my communities, to my family. And so because of that, because he has so clearly stated what he is going to do to immigrants and undocumented immigrants, that he's going to round them up and deport them like we've never seen before. He's clearly said that he supports a federal abortion ban, that he supports, at one point, he has often said that he supports punishing the women and the people who are pregnant who have had abortion. He supports punishing the doctors who give abortions. To me, I have to vote. I have to hold the contradiction of an imperfect candidate to also live in a very imperfect country. And that voting is just one tool in a very robust toolbox of fighting for our liberation.
I do think that each vote matters. And I am actually a Latina with a dual citizenship in the US. I'm going to vote this November, as always I have been doing. And I will say to the Latino community that I have two beautiful daughters of 12 and 8 years old. And I have had the great privilege of accessing education and deciding when and how I wanted to have my daughters. I also have had the opportunity to reconcile work and motherhood, but those should not be privileged and should become rights to all. As a Latina and Latinos and Latinettes, as Monica said, we have a unique voice to say that desired motherhoods, healthy families, and healthy generations are important. So your vote matters. And I hope you can go in November and make your election.
Paola, Ximena, and Danielle, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I hope our listeners are empowered to know that each of us has a role to play in someone else's liberation. Gen Z and Latino voters are going to be key in shaping the future of the country. We can all be a part of rebuilding a future that prioritizes bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom in the United States and beyond.
Next week, we're focusing on the US. We'll hear from organizers and leaders who are doing some incredible work on the ground, working right on the southern border to ensure people living in the states with extreme bans can still access reproductive care.
Not only will we be talking about self-managed abortion, but also how being deeply religious doesn't necessarily mean you have to be anti-abortion, but in fact, can be the very reason for supporting it.
That's next time on Green Tide Rising.
This episode was produced and written by Monica Morales Garcia. Green Tide Rising is executive produced by Jess Jacobs and Leela Meadow-Connor, with associate producer Addie Biaringer.
And produced in partnership with Pod People.
Our theme music was composed by Andres Aspiri.
I'm your host, Monica Morales Garcia.
And I'm your host and executive producer, Asha Dyer.
Join us again on Green Tide Rising. And in the meantime, head over to our YouTube channel to watch and share our accompanying video series, Entonces. Link in the show notes.
You can also find us on social media and see more about this episode on our website, greentiderising.com. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. Bye for now.
Adios.